A Miss Marple Mystery, The Clockmaker's Last Secret. Part 1. The Village. That Time Forgot. There is something about an English village in summer that makes you believe nothing truly terrible could ever happen there. The roses climb the garden walls with such unhurried confidence. The bees drift from flower to flower as though they have all the time in the world. The postman whistles the same 3 bars of the same forgotten song every single morning, and the sound carries across the green like a small, cheerful promise that today will be exactly like yesterday. Little Fenwick was precisely such a village. It sat in a shallow fold of the English countryside, cupped between 2 gentle hills, as though nature herself had decided to keep it safe from the noisier world beyond. The High Street, if you could call it that, for it was really nothing more than a wide lane lined with crooked old buildings, held a post office, a pub called the Heron and Hound, a small general store run by the Motley family for 3 generations, and, at the far end near the old stone bridge, the clockmaker's shop of Mr. Cornelius Hatch. The shop had no proper sign. It never needed one. Everybody in Little Fenwick knew where to find Cornelius Hatch, and those who didn't need only follow the sound. A soft, overlapping chorus of ticking that spilled out under the shop door and into the lane like music from another century. People said that if you stood outside Hatch's shop for long enough, you stopped being in a hurry about anything at all. There was something about all those clocks, all measuring time so carefully and so steadily. That made one's own anxieties feel rather small. Cornelius himself matched his shop in every important way. He was 71 years old and wore the same brown waistcoat he had worn since 1949. He had thin white hair that sat on his head like a crown of frost, and eyes of an unusual pale grey. The sort of eyes that seemed to be looking at something just slightly beyond whatever was directly in front of them. He had never married. He had few close friends, but many acquaintances, and nearly everybody in the village felt, obscurely, that Cornelius Hatch was good for Little Fenwick in some way that they couldn't quite articulate. He was part of the place, like the church, or the old elm at the edge of the green. He had learned his trade from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. He could tell you the provenance of any clock made between 1820 and 1960 by looking at it for 30 seconds. He could hear a fault in a mechanism before you'd even open the case. He was, by any measure, a craftsman of the old school, a man who believed that things worth making were worth making properly, and that shortcuts were for people who didn't care about their own souls. His shop was a museum of time itself. Bracket clocks and long case clocks, carriage clocks and skeleton clocks, painted Vienna regulators and dark mahogany grandmother clocks. They lined every wall and covered every surface, and all of them ran. Not one was merely decorative. Cornelius had no patience for clocks that didn't work. A stopped clock, he was fond of saying, is just a liar with a pretty face. It was into this village, on the 15th of July, that Miss Jane Marple arrived. She came by the afternoon train from London, having spent the previous week visiting her nephew Raymond and his rather exhausting wife in Hampstead. Raymond was a novelist, and believed, as novelists sometimes do, that real life was simply raw material waiting to be improved upon. His conversations tended to spiral into pronouncements. Miss Marple loved him dearly and was always glad to leave. Her destination was the cottage of Mrs. Dolly Bantry, née Dolly Bantry of Gossington Hall, though the hall itself was long since sold and Dolly now kept a charming, slightly overstuffed cottage on the eastern edge of Little Fenwick. Dolly was an old friend, the kind of friend whose company required no performance. She would have tea ready and a fire laid even in summer, because Dolly had always felt the world went better with a fire. "Darling Jane," said Dolly at the door, already pulling off Miss Marple's coat with the cheerful efficiency of a woman who had been managing things all her life. "You look absolutely peaky. Was it Raymond again?" "Raymond is very well," said Miss Marple diplomatically. "He has a new theory about the nature of fiction." "Good Lord," Dolly steered her toward the sitting room. "Then you definitely need tea. Sit down and don't think about fiction for a moment." Miss Marple sat gratefully in a chair that had the pleasant quality of all good chairs. It suggested that nothing urgent need happen for quite some time. She looked out the window at the lane beyond the garden wall and felt the particular quietness of Little Fenwick settle around her like a shawl. "How long can you stay?" Dolly called from the kitchen. "A fortnight, if you'll have me." "A month," Dolly said firmly. "There's absolutely nothing happening here, which is exactly what you need. Nothing ever happens in Little Fenwick." Miss Marple smiled at this, though she did not say what she was thinking. What she was thinking was that, in her considerable experience, nothing ever happened anywhere, right up until the moment it did. She sipped her tea and watched a blackbird land on the garden wall and cock its head with that bright, unnerving intelligence that blackbirds have. The afternoon was golden and still. Somewhere down the lane, too far away to identify its source, she heard the faint multiple heartbeat of many clocks ticking in perfect overlapping unison. She found it oddly beautiful. She did not know. Sitting there in Dolly's comfortable chair with her tea growing pleasantly cool in her hand, that by this time tomorrow, the man who tended all those clocks would be dead. She did not know that the village she had come to for rest and quiet would become, within 24 hours, the scene of a murder so carefully constructed that even Inspector Gerald Moss of the County Constabulary would call it, in a moment of unguarded honesty, the cleverest thing I've ever seen. She would have disagreed with that characterization in the end. She would have said it wasn't clever at all. It was merely human, which was to say, it was driven by fear and greed and vanity, and it had left behind exactly the kind of small, overlooked detail that fear and greed and vanity always leave behind. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, there was only the blackbird, and the tea, and the faraway music of Cornelius Hatch's clocks counting out the hours. Part 2. A Body and a Stopped Watch. The discovery was made at 3:30 in the afternoon by young Thomas, whose real name was Thomas Weir, and who was 17 years old, and who had been apprenticed to Cornelius Hatch for the past 2 years in what everyone agreed was a sensible arrangement, Thomas being both clever with his hands and somewhat at a loss regarding everything else. He had been at the post office on an errand, collecting a parcel of spare escapement parts that Cornelius had ordered from a supplier in Birmingham, and when he returned to find the shop door unlocked but the interior silent, he thought at first that Mr. Hatch must be having his afternoon rest in the back room. This happened sometimes. Cornelius was 71, and the afternoons could be heavy. But the silence was wrong. Thomas would struggle for weeks afterward to explain what he meant by this, and people would give him the patient, slightly uncomfortable look that people give you when you are describing something they would rather not think about. What he meant was that the silence had a quality he had never encountered before, a thickness to it, a kind of a held breath, as though the shop itself knew something he didn't. And the clocks, they were still ticking, all of them, and yet somehow the sound was different, emptier, as though the ticking was happening in a room that no longer had a centre. He found Cornelius in the workroom behind the shop. The old man was sitting in his chair, the tall-backed wooden chair he used at his workbench, and he was leaning back in a way that was not quite natural, not the lean of a man resting, but the lean of a man who has simply stopped. His face was peaceful, almost composed, which would later strike Miss Marple as one of the more significant details, though she would keep this observation to herself for some time. In his chest, angled slightly to the left, was a clock hand, the long minute hand from what appeared to be a pocket watch. It was approximately 4 inches in length, made of blued steel, and pointed upward at precisely the angle of accusation. Thomas Weir stood in the doorway for what he afterwards described as a very long time, but was probably 15 seconds. Then he set down the parcel from Birmingham, very carefully, is on the nearest flat surface, and went to telephone the police. He did not touch anything. He did not go closer. He was 17 years old, and he had just found the only person who had ever looked at him, as though he might amount to something, and the only thing his mind could manage in the hollow space where rational thought had briefly departed was a single repeated instruction. Don't touch anything. Don't touch anything. Don't touch anything. It was good advice. He followed it. Inspector Gerald Moss arrived within the hour, accompanied by Sergeant Fielding and a police doctor named Hargreaves, who had the focused, slightly abstracted manner of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by any of it. The constabulary set up a perimeter. The word seemed rather grand for what was essentially a rope across the lane, and the village gathered at a respectful distance to murmur and speculate. Inspector Moss was a solid man in every sense. Solid in build, solid in manner, solid in his opinions, which once formed tended not to shift regardless of what was placed in front of them. He had been with the County Constabulary for 22 years, and had solved a satisfactory number of cases by applying straightforward logic to straightforward crime. He was not unintelligent, but he believed, with a conviction that was almost philosophical, that the simplest explanation was almost always correct. He surveyed the workroom with his hands clasped behind his back and his mouth pressed into a thin line of professional appraisal. The room told a story, and he thought, and it was not a complicated one. The back window was latched but could be easily forced. There were signs of disturbance near the small safe in the corner. The rug was displaced, the safe door was not fully closed. The clock hand as a weapon was unusual but not impossible. There were any number of them lying about the workbench, some of considerable length and sharpness. A robbery gone wrong, an intruder who panicked. "Straightforward enough," he said to Sergeant Fielding. "The clocks, sir," said Fielding. "What about them?" Fielding gestured at the walls. Miss Marple, who had slipped in with Dolly Bantry at the edge of the small crowd of officially permitted observers. Dolly knew everybody and had simply walked through the rope barrier with the confidence of a woman who had chaired committees, looked where Fielding was pointing. Every clock in the shop had been stopped, not wound down, not run out of power, stopped deliberately, hands forced to the same position, 2:17, on the grandfather clock in the hall, 2:17, on the 12 bracket clocks on the high shelf, 2:17, on the 4 mantel clocks and the 2 Vienna regulators and the cuckoo clock that Cornelius kept purely for the amusement of visiting children, 2:17, every single one. "Someone stopped them," Fielding said, "all at the same time, to make us think he died at 2:17. To confuse the time of death," Inspector Moss agreed, with the air of a man who has just had something explained to him and is now explaining it to someone else. "Throw us off the trail, we won't let it." He made a note in his book. Miss Marple, standing very quietly beside a rather large long-case clock, was also thinking about the stopped clocks. But she was thinking something rather different than Inspector Moss. She was thinking about what it would take to stop every clock in that shop, the patience of it, the thoroughness. Each clock would have had to be approached individually, its hands moved to precisely the same position. In a shop full of ticking mechanisms, some of them delicate, some requiring care not to damage the escapement, this would have taken time, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps more. And while someone spent 10 minutes carefully stopping every clock, the body of Cornelius Hatch was growing cold 3 feet away. She was also thinking about the face of the dead man, that composed, almost peaceful expression, and about the teacup she'd noticed on the small table beside his workbench, holding perhaps half an inch of tea that had not quite finished cooling, and about the clock hand in his chest, which was a clock hand, and not a knife, and not a letter opener, and not any of the dozens of other sharp implements that had been within arm's reach of someone standing in that workroom. Why a clock hand? Why take the trouble? "A burglar wouldn't stop the clocks," she murmured, very quietly, to no one in particular. Dolly, at her elbow, looked at her sharply. "What was that, Jane?" "Nothing, dear," said Miss Marple. "Only thinking." She was looking at young Thomas, who stood apart from everyone else near the open door to the lane, his arms wrapped around himself despite the warmth of the afternoon. He had not cried. That was the thing about shock. It sometimes skipped over crying entirely and went straight to somewhere colder and quieter. His eyes met Miss Marple's for just a moment, and what she saw there was not grief alone. There was something else, a smaller, tighter thing nested inside the grief, something that looked, to her rather practised eye, very much like terror. Not the terror of a boy who had found a body, the terror of a boy who was afraid of what might come next. Part 3. The People of Little Fenwick. Miss Marple had spent the better part of 80 years observing human nature in all its infinite and largely repetitive variety, and she had arrived at certain conclusions that she held with the quiet confidence of hard-won knowledge. One of these conclusions was that you could learn more about a murder by learning about the murdered person than by examining the scene of the crime. The scene was fixed, already past, already finished. The person was still unfinished in a sense, still present in the lives of everyone they had touched, still capable of explanation. So on the morning after the discovery of Cornelius Hatch's body, while Inspector Moss pursued his burglary theory with the determined single-mindedness of a man who has decided on his destination before checking his map, Miss Marple went visiting. She brought her knitting. This was strategic. People talked more freely when you appeared to be doing something else. The needles moved and the wool accumulated, and you seemed to be only half present, absorbed in your work, and somehow this created an atmosphere of casualness in which people said things they might otherwise have thought better of. Her first call was on Mrs. Tilda Price. Tilda Price lived 2 doors down from the clockmaker's shop in a cottage that smelled agreeably of lavender and old books. She was a widow of 68, a small, neat woman with quick, dark eyes, and the careful manner of someone who had learned, over many years, to be a reliable recipient of other people's confidences without ever quite giving away her own. She knew everything that happened in Little Fenwick. This was not gossip, or not only gossip. It was the natural consequence of having lived in one place for 40 years with your eyes and ears open. She received Miss Marple with evident pleasure. Tea appeared within minutes, alongside a plate of shortbread that had been made that morning, and they sat in the front parlour with the windows open onto the lane. "Terrible business," said Mrs. Price, with the composed regret of someone who has already processed their initial shock and arrived at a kind of sorrowful equilibrium. "He was a peculiar man in his way, but decent. The village won't be the same. You knew him well?" "Well enough. We'd been neighbours 15 years. He wasn't what you'd call warm," she paused. "But he was honest. That counts for something, I think, more than people realise. He never said a thing he didn't mean." "And the others?" Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. "His niece. I understand she visits." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Mrs. Price's expression. "Vivian comes every few months. She's in London. Works for some sort of events company, I think. Very glamorous." The word carried the faint ambivalence of someone for whom glamour is not quite a compliment. "She's his only family. She'll inherit, I imagine." "Were they close?" A pause. "He provided for her," Mrs. Price said carefully. "Whether that's the same as close, I'm not sure." She looked at her teacup. "He gave her an allowance every month. I know this because he mentioned it once. Not as a complaint exactly, more as a resignation. He said she had expensive habits and not enough discipline to manage money, and that he hoped she'd grow out of it." "Had she?" "I wouldn't think so," said Mrs. Price with quiet directness. "When she was here in April, she was wearing a coat that must have cost £800, and she spent 20 minutes on the telephone in the lane arguing with someone about a credit card bill. She smoothed her skirt with both hands. I wasn't eavesdropping. My front window was open." Miss Marple smiled. "And Mr. Oliver Fenn, I believe he's been visiting Cornelius?" Here the quality of Mrs. Price's reticence changed. It became more deliberate, more textured, the reticence of someone who has something specific to protect. "Oliver Fenn has been coming to the village for about 6 months. He's an antique dealer from Bristol, clocks and watches mostly." She set down her teacup. "He wanted to buy something from Cornelius, one of the older pieces. Cornelius wouldn't sell it. Do you know which piece?" "A pocket watch. Very old. Pre-Victorian, I think. Cornelius said it had been in the family for generations and wasn't for sale at any price." She paused. "Mr. Fenn didn't take it well. He came back 3 times. Each time the conversation was heated. I could hear them through the wall when the weather was warm and the windows were open." "I see," said Miss Marple, and she did see, or was beginning to. She moved on that afternoon to the Heron and Hound, where she found Oliver Fenn himself at a corner table with a pint of bitter and a London newspaper that he didn't appear to be reading. He was a man in his mid-50s, well dressed in the particular way of people who spend money on their clothes, but have no natural elegance. The jacket was good, the trousers were good, but something about the way he wore them suggested they were armour rather than clothing. He was not initially inclined to talk. But Miss Marple had a gift for making people talk that had nothing to do with interrogation, and everything to do with the simple, disarming quality of being genuinely interested in them as human beings. She sat down at the adjacent table with her knitting and her mild blue eyes and her air of benign inconsequence, and within 10 minutes Oliver Fenn was telling her things he almost certainly hadn't meant to. He had been in the antiques trade for 30 years. He specialised in horological pieces, clocks, watches, barometers. He had identified, through research he was characteristically vague about, that Cornelius Hatch was in possession of a pocket watch, a Breguet, early 19th century, Kier one of perhaps 6 examples known to exist, that the auction market would value at somewhere between £80,000 and £120,000. "He wouldn't sell," Fenn said, with a frustration that had clearly not diminished with time. "I offered him 50,000. I offered him 65. He sat there in that damn chair with his arms folded and told me the watch wasn't for sale and never would be, as if I was being unreasonable. Perhaps it had sentimental value," Miss Marple offered. Everything has sentimental value when someone wants to buy it. He said this with the bitterness of a man who had found it true too many times. Then he appeared to catch himself. "I'm sorry, that was uncharitable. The man's just been killed." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Yes." "Ah, he has?" She looked at her knitting with what appeared to be focused concentration. "The watch. I imagine it will be part of the estate now. His niece will inherit." Something crossed Fenn's face, quick, almost suppressed. Not surprise exactly. More like a man who has just had a thought he wishes he hadn't had. "Yes," he said. "I imagine so." "I expect," said Miss Marple tranquilly, "that she may be rather more open to offers." The silence that followed this remark was, Miss Marple felt, extremely informative. She thought about it on the walk back to Dolly's cottage in the early evening, when the lane was full of long shadows and the air smelled of warm grass and something faintly floral from someone's kitchen garden. She thought about Vivian Hatch and her expensive coat and her credit card arguments. She thought about Oliver Fenn and his £80,000 to £120,000 watch. She thought about the careful, deliberate act of stopping every clock in a dead man's shop. And then she thought about Dr. Prentice. She had not yet spoken to Dr. Prentice, but she had seen him twice. Once at the scene of the crime, standing at the edge of the gathering with his hands in his pockets, and an expression of grave concern that was, to her eye, doing a great deal of work. And once this morning, from Dolly's upstairs window, walking past the clockmaker's shop with his eyes straight ahead, and his jaw set in a way that suggested he was working very hard at not looking at it. A man who had lost a friend, she thought, would look. A man who was carefully not looking might be carrying something heavier than grief. She went home to dinner, and to thinking, and to the small, persistent ticking of all those stopped clocks she could still hear in her mind, frozen at 2:17, telling a lie about time. Part 4. The Doctor's Peculiar Silence. Dr. Prentice had his surgery in a grey stone house at the northern edge of Little Fenwick, and he had lived and worked there for 26 years, with the settled competence of a man who has found his place in the world and asked no more of it. He was 64 years old, lean and upright, with close-cropped grey hair and the careful, measured manner of a doctor of the old school, the kind who listened before speaking and said less than he knew. He was well liked, which is different from being well loved. People trusted him with their health and respected his judgment and were grateful for his patience during long appointments. But if you pressed them on whether they truly knew him, a certain hesitation would emerge. He was private. He kept the personal details of his life as tidily contained as the instruments in his medical bag. He had been married. Briefly long ago it had not been discussed. He had no children. He had friends in the way that private men have friends. Surface warmth, genuine affection at a distance, and a locked room somewhere in the middle. Cornelius Hatch had been one of his closest friends. This surprised people because the two men were so different. Cornelius all roughness and directness and tobacco-stained fingers. Prentice all precision and control. But perhaps that was why it worked. Each offered what the other lacked. Miss Marple called on the doctor the following morning, presenting herself as a patient, entirely truthfully. She had a persistent stiffness in her left knee that had been troubling her since winter, and sat in his waiting room among the village's minor invalids with her knitting and her patients. When she was shown in, Dr. Prentice received her with professional courtesy, examined her knee with genuine attention, prescribed a liniment that she already possessed, and seemed about to conclude the appointment when she said, quite gently, "You are a friend of Mr. Hatch's, I believe. I'm very sorry for your loss," he stilled. It was the smallest thing, a fractional pause in the movement of reaching for his prescription pad. But Miss Marple caught it. "We were friends, yes," he said, "for many years." "It must be very difficult," she said, "the suddenness of it, and the violence." She watched him. "I imagine it's hard to make sense of. Murder is generally hard to make sense of. And yet," she said, with the mild persistence that was her particular gift, "people do sometimes understand it, when they know the person well enough, when they've seen the circumstances." His eyes came up to meet hers, and for the first time she saw behind the professional composure, not to guilt, not yet, but to something troubled and complex that had been sitting behind his eyes for 2 days like a stone at the bottom of a clear stream. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "I think," she said gently, "that you may know rather more about what Cornelius was involved in than you've told Inspector Moss." The silence stretched. Outside, through the window, she could hear sparrows in the garden. "I've told the inspector everything relevant," he said. "At last." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That's what concerns me, rather." She left without pressing further. She had learned over decades that there was a kind of pressure that worked not by pushing, but by leaving a space, a question asked and then departed from, which had a way of continuing to work on the person long after the conversation had ended. Walking back down the lane, she turned over what she had observed. The hesitation, the controlled quality of his distress, too controlled for simple grief, and the thing she had noticed at the crime scene and filed away carefully. When Inspector Moss had described the weapon to the assembled neighbours, a clock hand driven into the victim's chest, everyone in the group had reacted with the flinching, visceral horror that such a description naturally provoked. Everyone except Dr. Prentice. He had nodded. A small composed nod as of someone receiving information they already possessed. The inspector, who was looking at the scene and not at the faces, had not seen it. Sergeant Fielding, who was looking at his notebook, had not seen it. Dolly, who was genuinely appalled and occupied with being appalled, had not seen it. Miss Marple had seen it. She sat with Dolly that evening after dinner, in the comfortable sitting room with its cheerful fire. Dolly's fires were a matter of principle rather than necessity, and knitted in contemplative silence, while Dolly read a very exciting novel about a baronet. "What do you know about the land dispute?" Miss Marple asked, apparently from nowhere. Dolly put down the baronet. She was, beneath her sociable surface, a sharp woman who had survived a great deal, and she recognised when Jane was working. "Which land dispute?" "Is there more than one?" Dolly thought. "There's always the usual sort of disagreements, fence lines, rights of way. But if you mean the big one, the Morrowfield business?" She pulled a small, remembering face. "That goes back 30 years or more. The Morrow family had a large farm on the eastern side of the village. All died out. No heirs. The last one was old Arthur Morrow, who died in 1991. The land should have been disputed, I think, but somehow it wasn't. It ended up with—" She stopped, looked at Miss Marple. "It ended up with Dr. Prentice." "How?" "Some sort of property transfer. I never knew the exact details. It was before I moved here." "Who would know the exact details?" Dolly considered. "Cornelius Hatch might have known." "He'd lived here his whole life." A pause. "He kept records of all sorts of things. He was methodical that way." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I rather thought he might have been." She went to bed that night thinking about 30-year-old property transfers and the particular fear that attaches not to past mistakes but to the possibility of their discovery. She thought about what a man might do if he had built his life, his house, his practice, his reputation, his careful measured peace, on a foundation that someone else had the power to expose. She thought about what a friend, or a former friend, might know, and she thought about a document, something old, something that had been kept safe in a workroom full of clocks, all of which had been stopped to tell a lie about time. Sleep when it came was not restful. Or Part 5. Vivian. Vivian. Hatch arrived in Little Fenwick on the Thursday morning 2 days after her uncle's death, in a silver car that was too expensive for the lane, and which she parked with the mild imperiousness of someone who expects obstacles to solve themselves. She was 34 years old, dark-haired, and beautiful in the aggressive, finished way of people who have made a project of their own appearance. Her clothes were exactly as Mrs. Price had described, well beyond the budget of a woman who owed money. She came first to the cottage of Mrs. Bantry, because Mrs. Bantry had telephoned with condolences and the mention of a friend who happened to be staying. An elderly lady who sometimes noticed things that were useful to know. Miss Marple received her in the sitting room with tea and the quiet attention that had disarmed several dozen people before Vivian Hatch, and would disarm several dozen after. Vivian's grief was real. That was the first thing Miss Marple noted. It was complicated by guilt and layered over with the particular shame of people who have not always been kind and who discover too late that kindness is irreplaceable. But underneath all that, the grief itself was genuine. She had loved her uncle in the limited, intermittent way of someone who was mostly preoccupied with their own life, but who had always assumed he would be there. He was difficult, she said, after the first cup of tea, when the formal condolences had settled into something more honest. You probably know that. He thought I was a fool with money. He said so, fairly regularly. She looked at her hands. He was right, actually. I owe rather a lot to rather a lot of people. Did he know the extent of it? I tried to keep it from him. He would have been—" She paused, looking for the word. Disappointed is too small. He would have felt it as a moral failure. He felt everything as a moral or practical failure. A small, sad smile. He was very old-fashioned that way. He was generous with you, though, the allowance. Yes, more than I deserved. She looked out the window. He wrote to me last month. It was a strange letter. He said he'd found something, an old document, that he'd had in his keeping for years without understanding its full significance. He said it was going to need to be dealt with. I didn't know what he meant. I still don't. Miss Marple kept her expression mild. Interested, but not urgent. Did he say what kind of document? Something to do with land. A legal agreement or deed of some kind, he said. He mentioned a family name. Morrow, I think. He was going to speak to a solicitor about it. She picked up her teacup with both hands. I'm telling the police this. I've already mentioned it to the inspector. He didn't seem particularly interested. Of course he hadn't. Inspector Moss had his burglar and his straightforward robbery gone wrong, and old land deeds didn't fit the picture he'd already drawn. Was the document in the shop? Miss Marple asked. I've no idea. I haven't been allowed in yet. Her voice tightened. They're treating it like a crime scene. Which I suppose it is. A pause. His solicitor came this morning to discuss the will. There are some small bequests. The apprentice boy gets something, which is kind, and I get the rest. The shop, the contents, the house, and whatever debts. She said this last with the resignation of someone who expected to find more of them than she was hoping. The pocket watch, said Miss Marple. Do you know about the Breguet watch? Vivian looked at her with sharper focus. Oliver Fenn's watch? Yes. He wrote to me about it last week. Oliver did. Apparently he's been trying to buy it from Uncle Cornelius for months. He wants to make a new offer now that— She stopped. He was very prompt. People who want things usually are. He's offered £110,000. She said the number flatly, but something in her manner changed at the edges. A slight tightening, a barely perceptible attention. Cash transaction? Quick completion. And will you sell it? The pause before she answered was longer than it should have been. I haven't decided yet. Miss Marple set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at Vivian Hatch with the direct, gentle gaze that she reserved for moments when she was about to say something that mattered. My dear, she said, your uncle was not killed by a burglar. I think you probably know that. And I think, when you know who did kill him, you will also understand why a £110,000 offer arrived within 2 days of his death. Vivian looked at her for a long moment without speaking. You think they're connected, she said at last. The murder and the watch. Not the watch, precisely. Then what? The document, said Miss Marple quietly. The document about the Morrow land. The colour in Vivian's face changed. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. A slight deepening around the eyes, a slight compression of the lips. She was, Miss Marple thought, not so much shocked as confirmed in something she had been afraid to think directly. I see, she said. And then, after a moment, what do I do? For now, said Miss Marple, I think you should find out whether that document was among the things in your uncle's shop. And if it was, I think you should make sure it is kept somewhere very safe before you speak to anyone else about it. She left Vivian at the front gate, standing with her expensive coat and her complicated grief, and walked slowly back toward the high street, past the old elm on the green and the post office and the Heron and Hound, and at the end of the lane. The clockmaker's shop, with its police tape still across the door and all its stopped clocks inside, silent now as they had never been silent in living memory. She paused outside it for a moment. A small brass plate beside the door read, C. Hatch, Clockmaker, East, 1978. Below it, in smaller letters that had been added later and were slightly less well aligned, by appointment to those who value good work. She thought about a man who had spent his life mending things, making the stopped things run again, and she thought about the particular cruelty of killing such a man with his own tools, of stopping his clocks and stopping him at the same moment. There was something in it that felt like a signature, not a deliberate one, but a signature nonetheless. Part 6. The teacup and the timing Inspector Moss permitted Miss Marple into the clockmaker's shop on Friday afternoon, with a graciousness that had more to do with Dolly Bantry's forceful social manner than with any particular openness on his part. He remained present throughout, or rather, present in the way of someone who is technically present but has already mentally departed. Miss Marple was grateful for this. Divided attention was better than none at all. The shop was very quiet. The clocks were still stopped, all of them at 2:17, their silence almost physical. The same way the silence of an empty theatre is different from the silence of an empty room. These clocks were built to run. Their stillness was wrong in a way that made the air feel thin. She moved through the space slowly, her cane tapping on the flagstone floor, her eyes moving without apparent urgency from detail to detail. Inspector Moss watched her from the doorway with the patient tolerance of a man enduring something harmless. The front of the shop was as she had remembered, clocks on every surface, the glass cases along one wall containing the smaller, more valuable pieces, the long case clock by the door with its pendulum hanging motionless. The workbench along the back wall was covered in the organised scatter of an active craftsman, tools at precise angles, parts in small labelled trays, a magnifying glass on an articulated arm, a jeweller's loop beside it. She moved into the back room. This was where Cornelius had died. The chair had been moved. It would be in a police facility somewhere. But the outline of the space remained. The small table beside where the chair had stood. The window with its latch. The safe in the corner, which Sergeant Fielding had already established, contained only working documents, and nothing of obvious value. No cash, no jewellery. The teacup was still on the table. This was what she had come for in one sense, but she did not go to it immediately. She went first to the window, examining the latch. It was a simple mechanism, the kind that could be lifted from outside with a thin blade if you knew what you were doing. She noted this without expressing an opinion about it. She went to the workbench and looked at the tools. Among them, in a shallow tray labelled in Cornelius's neat hand, parts, pocket. She could see several clock hands of various sizes. Some were short, stubby hour hands, some were long and pointed. She looked at the tray for a moment, then at the empty space where one of the longer ones might have lain. The weapon then had been taken from this room, from this tray most probably. Had been at hand, available, the act therefore improvised rather than premeditated, or so it might appear. But Miss Marple considered this. The clocks had been stopped with great care and thoroughness. That was not improvisation, that was planning. The choice of weapon might have been improvised. One took what was at hand in a moment of decision, but everything afterward had been planned. She went to the teacup. It was a plain white cup on a plain white saucer, the kind found in every kitchen in England. There was a small amount of tea remaining in it, dark, sugared, cold now, but not completely dry. The cup sat on the right-hand side of the small table. The chair, when positioned at the workbench, would have had its right arm directly adjacent to this table. A comfortable position for a man who was having a visitor, a cup of tea at his right hand, a guest presumably seated in the second chair that now stood against the opposite wall. 2 cups had been used. She looked at the second one. On the mantelpiece she'd seen it earlier, now identified clearly as the cup from which a visitor had drunk. It had been washed, not replaced in a cupboard, simply washed and set on the mantelpiece wet-bottomed. Someone had washed their own cup but left Cornelius's. Why? In the urgency and disturbance of committing a murder, why stop to wash a single cup? To remove fingerprints? Of course. But why not take it away entirely? Why leave it in plain sight, washed, on the mantelpiece? Because leaving it was less suspicious than its absence, she thought. A visitor who was also a friend, a regular visitor, would leave their cup somewhere natural. Taking it away would be strange. Better to wash it and leave it in a natural place. This told her several things. The visitor was known, expected, had been there often enough to know where to put a washed cup. The murder had been committed with enough presence of mind to think about fingerprints before leaving. And the visitor had sat with Cornelius long enough to drink tea before the decision, or the opportunity, had presented itself. The tea in Cornelius's cup was still present and had not fully evaporated. She bent carefully over it without touching anything. The faint smell that reached her was exactly what she expected. Tea, slightly bitter, slightly sweet. And beneath both of those, beneath very faintly if you knew to look for it, something pharmaceutical. Something with the dry, clinical undertone of a substance that had no business being in a teacup. She straightened up and looked at Inspector Moss. "Inspector," she said, "I wonder whether the police doctor examined the contents of this cup." Moss frowned. "The cup? It's still here. The tea is still in it. I think it might be worth having the contents tested." She paused. "I believe Mr. Hatch may have been, how shall I put this, made more compliant before the clock hand was used." The inspector's frown deepened. "You mean he was poisoned?" "I mean," said Miss Marple carefully, "that I think someone gave him something in his tea that would have made him drowsy, unable to resist. And then—" She did not finish this sentence. It didn't need finishing. The peaceful expression, she thought, the composed face of a man who had not struggled, who had not had the chance or the capacity to struggle. That wasn't the face of a man who had been taken by surprise. That was the face of a man who was already not quite present when the final moment came. Moss was looking at the cup with a new and reluctant interest. "We'd have to send it to the county lab," he said. "I rather think you should," said Miss Marple, and then, collecting herself, and her cane, and her air of mild inconsequence, "Thank you so much for allowing me in, Inspector. I've always been terribly interested in clocks." She left him standing in the workroom staring at a teacup, and walked out into the afternoon with the feeling, familiar, not quite pleasant, of a picture assembling itself. Not complete yet. Several pieces still to place, but the shape of it visible now, the outline clear, and the centre, the cold, deliberate, frightened centre, coming into focus. Part 7. Young Thomas speaks. He was sitting on the stone wall at the edge of the green, throwing bits of bread at an unconcerned duck when Miss Marple found him. It was early evening, the sky pale and the shadows long, and he looked like exactly what he was, a boy who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and was running out of places to put it. She sat down on the wall beside him, at a comfortable distance, and for a while said nothing at all. The duck accepted the bread. A pigeon arrived to argue about territorial rights. Thomas threw more bread to prevent a confrontation. "The inquest will be next week," she said eventually. "Well, as to the heir rather than to him." "I know," he said. "They'll ask you what time you left the shop, what time you returned, whether you saw or heard anything unusual." "I already told the police all that." "Yes," she said. "I know. You left at 1:30 to go to the post office. You returned at 3:30 and found him." Silence. The duck had eaten all the bread and was now departing with the dignity of someone who has concluded a successful meeting. "Thomas," she said, still gently, still not looking at him directly, "there are several things that bother me about what happened that afternoon. One of them is this. The post office in Little Fenwick closes at 2:00. A parcel would have been available for collection by 1:30, which should have taken you no more than 20 minutes. But you weren't back until 3:30. A pause. That's 2 hours. The silence was a different kind of silence now, heavier, charged. "I went for a walk," he said. "Yes," she said. "I imagine you did. Along the river path, perhaps? The path that runs behind the church and loops back around past the eastern fields." He looked at her for the first time, a quick, startled look. "How did you know?" "Because it's a path that a young person who needed to think might naturally take. It's private. It's long enough to tire you out, which is sometimes the point." She watched a cloud move across the pale sky. "You were upset when you left, weren't you? Before you went to the post office. Something had happened." He said nothing. "Thomas," she said, and now she did look at him with the direct, as careful kindness that she could produce when she chose to. "You have not done anything wrong. I'm quite certain of that. But there is something you know, or something you saw or heard, that you haven't told anyone, and it is costing you a great deal to keep it." His jaw was very tight. He was 17 and trying very hard to be controlled, and she had a sudden, clear memory of her own nephew Raymond at 17, trying with equal determination to be composed about something that had broken his heart and making exactly the same tight face. The young was so convinced that admitting emotion was a defeat. "He was arguing," Thomas said at last, very quietly. "That morning, before I left, someone came in, a regular visitor. I knew the voice, and it started off normally, just conversation, and then it changed. The voices went quiet, which was worse, like a fight that's gone past shouting." He threw the last crumb at the absent duck. "I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the tone." "Who was it?" He swallowed. "Dr. Prentice." She had expected this, but she kept her expression unchanged. "And the argument? Could you tell what it concerned?" "Something about a piece of paper. Mr. Hatch said, this much I heard, because he raised his voice once. I've kept it this long out of loyalty to you, Maurice, and that's more than you deserved." And then the voices went down again. He paused. "Maurice is the doctor's first name. What happened then?" "I had the errand to do. I left." He was silent for a moment. "And when I came back, he was dead." Another silence. "If I'd stayed, if I hadn't gone for the walk, if I'd come back sooner?" "No," said Miss Marple. Firmly, but gently. "None of that. The time of death, as best as can be established, was between 1 and 2 in the afternoon. You couldn't have changed anything by returning earlier. The only thing you might have changed is what happened to yourself, and I think you were probably safer on that river path than you know." He looked at her sharply. "You said a regular visitor," she said. Dr. Prentice had visited Cornelius often then. Every few weeks. They'd have tea. They'd been friends for years. His voice had a bleakness in it that went beyond the words. "I always liked it when the doctor came. Mr. Hatch was easier after, more relaxed. And recently, in the last month or two, different," Thomas said. "Shorter, less comfortable. Like something had changed between them and neither of them was talking about it." He picked at a loose chip in the stone wall. "Mr. Hatch told me once that the worst thing about getting old was watching people you trusted choose to be something other than you'd believed them to be. I thought it was just something old people said. I didn't know he meant someone specific." Miss Marple thought about this for a moment, about a friendship of 20-something years and a document kept out of loyalty, and the moment when loyalty collides with conscience and something has to give. "Thomas," she said, "the letter that Mr. Hatch was expecting from his solicitor, do you know whether it arrived?" He looked at her. "No letter came, but—" He hesitated. "The week before he died, he gave me an envelope, told me to keep it, not open it. And if anything happened to him, to give it to someone trustworthy, someone with no connection to the village." Her heart was very still. "Do you have it?" He reached inside his jacket, an overlarge second-hand jacket, of the kind worn by boys who have not yet grown into their own style, and produced a plain white envelope, sealed with nothing written on the outside. "I thought," he said, "that you might be the someone trustworthy he meant." She took the envelope with both hands, with a care that was partly practical and partly something else. Respect for the dead man who had prepared this, who had known what was coming, who had tried, with the last of his failing protection, to make sure the truth survived him. "You've been very brave," she said, "and very right." He looked at the river which was catching the last light. "Will it be enough to catch whoever did it?" "I think," she said carefully, "and that it may be exactly what's needed." She took the envelope home and did not open it that evening, though the temptation was considerable. She set it on the table beside her lamp and looked at it for a while, and thought about Cornelius Hatch at his work-bench, methodical, honest, unsparing of self-deception, and about what it must have cost him to realise that his loyalty to a friend had been, for 30 years, a kind of complicity in something wrong. She opened it in the morning in the fresh light with tea. Inside was a folded document, handwritten, dated 1992, bearing 2 signatures. She read it carefully, twice, and then set it down on the table. Outside, the village was waking up. The postman was whistling his 3 bars. A car went past on the lane. Somewhere a child was calling out to someone. She thought about what she held in her hands and what it meant, and what it would cost the people it concerned, and then she put on her reading glasses and read it a 3rd time very carefully, because there was no point in doing a thing unless you were sure of doing it properly. Cornelius, she thought, would have approved of that. Part 8. The Document's Secret. The document was 33 years old and 7 pages long. The handwriting was neat, small, and extremely precise, the writing of someone who had been trained in a formal era and maintained their standards regardless of what happened around them. It was dated the 14th of March, 1992, and it was headed in block letters that had been underlined. Memorandum of Understanding and Declaration, Morrow Estate. Miss Marple read it as she always read important things, slowly, with full attention, allowing the implications of each paragraph to settle before moving to the next. The story it told was not complicated, though it had been carefully obscured. In 1991, Arthur Morrow, the last of the little Fenwick Morrows, had died at 83, leaving no direct heirs. He had left a will, but the will had been ambiguous about the disposition of the farm's land. Some 20 acres of rich agricultural ground on the eastern side of the village, which also happened to include a stream, several mature hedgerows of ecological importance, and, as was discovered some years later, a corner of ancient woodland that various conservation bodies had expressed interest in purchasing. The ambiguity in Arthur Morrow's will had been deliberate, or so the document suggested. Arthur had intended the land to pass not to the distant cousin whose claim appeared on the face of the estate documents, but to the village itself, held in common, administered by a trust, available for community use and small-scale farming. He had discussed this intention in detail with two witnesses, his neighbour Cornelius Hatch, and his doctor, one Morris Prentice, then 37 years old and newly arrived in Little Fenwick. The problem, the document recorded with painful clarity, was that Arthur's formal will had not properly encoded this intention. The formal language was inadequate, and Arthur had died before a codicil could be drawn up. What had followed was documented here with the uncomfortable specificity of a man writing down something he was ashamed of but felt compelled to make permanent. Cornelius Hatch's handwriting throughout, Cornelius recording, as witness and participant, what he had seen happen. Morris Prentice, as the attending physician, had been involved in the administration of Arthur Morrow's final affairs. As such, he had access to documents. As such, he had understood, before the solicitors had fully assessed the estate, that the ambiguity in the will created a window, a brief, closable window, during which the disposition of the land was effectively undetermined. He had moved quickly, quietly. With the help of a solicitor who had since died, and whose files had since been destroyed in a conveniently timed flood, he had arranged a property transfer that conveyed the eastern field and its 20 acres to himself at a nominal sum, on the basis of a small loan he had made to Arthur Morrow in his final months. A loan that, the document noted, had been genuinely made, genuinely owed, but which would never have been expected by Arthur or by anyone who knew Arthur's intentions to be settled in land. Cornelius had not stopped it. He had, as he wrote in the document with the bluntness of a man who does not spare himself, said nothing. He had known. He had watched. He had been present for conversations that made the reality quite clear. And he had said nothing because Maurice was his friend, and because the land transfer had been done legally, technically, procedurally, within the letter, if not the spirit of the law, and because Arthur was dead and would not know, and because raising the matter felt somehow like a kind of disloyalty he couldn't quite bring himself to commit. But he had written it down, all of it, every conversation he remembered, every document he had seen, every date and detail. He had kept it because he felt, in some stubborn recess of his conscience, that the truth should exist somewhere even if it never came out. The document made clear that the land, if Arthur Morrow's true intentions were to be honoured, and if the community trust he had vaguely but genuinely intended could be reconstructed from the evidence of those intentions, should properly belong to the village, not to Morris Prentice, who had in the 33 intervening years done well from it. He had sold several acres to a developer in 2008 for residential purposes. He had leased other portions. He had, by any calculation, derived substantial benefit from a property that was, in the deepest moral sense, not his. And now, 33 years on, Cornelius Hatch had decided that the weight of this knowledge was too heavy for one old man to carry alone. He had, the document's final page revealed, recently been in contact with Arthur Morrow's great-niece, a woman in Canada who had never known about the village property, who had received nothing from the estate, and who, when contacted by Cornelius, had expressed both surprise and the intention to consult a solicitor. This had reached Dr. Prentice. Somehow, perhaps through something said, perhaps through the small invisible telegraph of a close community, it had reached him, and the friendship that had survived 33 years of guilty silence had cracked under the weight of what was about to come undone. Miss Marple sat back and looked at the ceiling. She thought about a man who had built a medical practice, a home, a professional reputation, a life, in a village where everyone knew him as a good man, a careful doctor, a decent neighbour, on ground that was not entirely his. Not stolen outright, not violently taken, but taken nonetheless, in a moment of opportunity and weakness, in the way that things are sometimes taken by people who tell themselves it is not really wrong. She thought about what 33 years of small self-justifications looked like from the inside. You would stop thinking about it after a while. You would let it calcify into simply the way things were. The land was yours. You had managed it, maintained it, paid taxes on it. The fact of possession would become, over decades, and almost indistinguishable from the right of it, until someone opened the window, until your oldest friend, who had stayed silent out of loyalty, told you that he couldn't stay silent anymore. She thought about the argument Thomas had overheard. I've kept it this long out of loyalty to you, Maurice. And the decision Prentice had made in the aftermath of that argument, not immediately, but in the days following, with a growing, cold, terrible clarity, that the only way to close the window permanently was to destroy the one person who could fully attest to what had happened inside it. Cornelius had kept the document. He had given it to Thomas. He had, in some careful part of himself that he had not been able to shut down, known what might be coming. She put the document in the inner pocket of her cardigan, close to her person. Then she picked up the telephone and called Inspector Moss. "Inspector," she said when he answered, "I wonder if you might come to Mrs. Bantry's cottage tomorrow evening. I think it would be helpful to bring the key suspects together in one place, and I think, I say this with the appropriate modesty, that I may be able to explain to you exactly what happened in that clockmaker's shop, and why, and by whom." A long pause from the inspector's end. "Miss Marple," he said, "this is not one of your—" "It is not anything," she said pleasantly. "It is simply that I have evidence you don't have, and a teacup I believe your laboratory will have found quite interesting, and a document that changes everything. Tomorrow evening, if you please. 7 o'clock. Pause. I'll ask Mrs. Bantry to make sandwiches." Part 9. The Evening Gathering. Dolly. Bantry rose to the occasion with the full commitment she brought to all practical endeavours, which was considerable. By 6:30 on Saturday evening, her sitting room had been arranged with the quiet authority of a woman who had hosted everything from church fetes to county committee meetings, and understood that the physical arrangement of a room could determine the emotional dynamics of what happened in it. The chairs were positioned so that no one could easily leave without passing everyone else. The fire had been lit. It was July, but Dolly felt that fires created a truthful atmosphere, and she was not wrong. The sandwiches were on a side table covered with a damp cloth in the way of sensible English households, available but not intrusive. The lighting was warm but adequate, bright enough to see faces, not so bright as to feel like an interrogation. Miss Marple sat in the high-backed chair she had claimed as her usual position since her arrival, her knitting in her lap, her expression that of a woman whose mind is placidly elsewhere. This was, of course, a studied performance. Her mind was precisely, entirely here. They arrived within 20 minutes of each other. Inspector Moss came first with Sergeant Fielding and a politely suppressed scepticism. He accepted tea, declined sandwiches, and sat with his notebook on his knee in the manner of a man who is here under protest but is too professional not to pay attention. Vivian Hatch arrived next, in a different and slightly less expensive coat than the one she had worn when Miss Marple first met her. A small, possibly unconscious adjustment that suggested she was recalibrating something about herself in the aftermath of her uncle's death. She sat near the window and did not take tea. Oliver Fenn came in just after her, with the slightly overdressed manner of a man who has dressed carefully to convey casualness. He looked at Vivian with an expression that mixed commercial interest with genuine discomfort, and sat as far from her as the room's arrangement permitted, which was not very far. Mrs. Tilda Price arrived at 3 minutes to 7, punctual in the way of people who are organised as a matter of principle, and sat near the fire with the compact, watchful manner that was her natural resting state. She'd brought nothing with her, asked for nothing, and looked at everyone in the room with a quick, evaluating thoroughness before settling her gaze on Miss Marple, with something that might have been, very privately, relief. Young Thomas was last. He came in with the hunched, self-conscious posture of a young person in a room full of adults, accepted a sandwich that he then didn't eat, and settled on a footstool near the door in a way that communicated both his wish to be present and his option to leave. Dr. Maurice Prentice arrived at 7:05. He came in composed, which was by now something Miss Marple could read with considerable fluency. His composure was the particular composure of a man who has spent several days preparing for something he cannot avoid, and has decided that the only dignity available to him is control. He was dressed neatly, a blazer, grey trousers, to have the professional presentation of a man who has always found his clothing a useful form of armour. He looked around the room with the precise, calibrated quality of someone counting the elements of a problem. His eyes reached Miss Marple last and stayed there for a moment. She met his gaze with the mild, pleasant expression she had worn for 40 years, at moments very much like this one. "Thank you all for coming," she said, to the room at large and to no one in particular. "I know this is an unusual request, and I'm grateful for your patience." She set her knitting down in her lap, a gesture that, in the context, functioned as a gavel might in a courtroom. "I want to talk about Cornelius Hatch." Moss shifted in his chair. "Miss Marple, I should say for the record—" "Yes, yes," she said with the gentle, slightly irresistible firmness of someone who has been managing inspectors since before the current inspector was born. "I know, you're in charge, and I'm merely a visitor who has been helpful. I understand completely. I only want to share some observations and evidence that I think will be useful to your investigation." She'd found, over the years, that this framing always worked. It gave the policeman the form of authority while allowing her to do the actual work. Inspector Moss settled back with a slightly pinched expression that she chose to interpret as acquiescence. "Cornelius Hatch," she said, "was a man who valued honesty almost as an article of faith. Not merely personal honesty. He was honest about himself too, about his own failings, which is rarer and harder. He had made a mistake 33 years ago. Not an active mistake, but a mistake of silence, of allowing something wrong to happen by not speaking. He had kept that silence for 3 decades. She paused. Recently something changed. He decided he could no longer keep it. She watched the room as she said this. Most faces showed the attentive blankness of people receiving information they cannot yet contextualize. Oliver Fenn's face showed a kind of wary calculation. Vivian Hatch's showed something that was trying not to be hope. Mrs. Price's showed privately recognition, and Dr. Prentice's face showed nothing at all. This was, she thought, the most significant response in the room. She began to explain what she had found. She described the document, not its precise contents yet, but its existence and its nature. She described the Morrowland and its history. She described, carefully, the transfer that had occurred in 1992. She did not use names yet. She let the shape of it assemble itself in the room first, let people begin to see where it was going. Thomas, on his footstool, was watching the doctor with the fixed, unable to look away intensity of someone confirming something they had suspected but hoped was wrong. "The person who killed Cornelius Hatch," Miss Marple said, settling her hands on her knitting, "was someone he trusted, someone he had welcomed into his shop with the ease of long acquaintance, someone to whom he had offered tea." She looked at the room. The fire crackled. Outside, a thrush sang the last few bars of its evening song. "The tea," she said, "is rather important, because Cornelius did not die from the clock hand alone." She could feel the quality of the silence change. Sharpen. "The county laboratory," said Inspector Moss, very quietly, "confirmed traces of triazolam in the cup's residue, a sedative." He was reading from his notebook, but his eyes were up, watching. "Fast acting. It would have made him drowsy and compliant within 20 minutes, Miss Marple said. Unable to call out, unable to resist, which is why there were no signs of struggle, and why his expression in death was so peaceful." She paused. "And which tells us that the person who gave him that tea was not an opportunist, was not a burglar who panicked, was someone who had come prepared, who had brought the substance with them, who had intended for some time before the moment arrived to end Cornelius Hatch's life." Part 10. The Unravelling. The room was very quiet. The fire made small sounds. Outside, the thrush had finished its song. The quality of the silence had changed from attentiveness to something more fragile. The silence of people at the edge of something they cannot take back once they've seen it. Miss Marple did not hurry. She had learned long ago that the truth had its own momentum once you began to release it, and that attempting to rush the process usually damaged something. The stopped clocks, she said, were intended to confuse the time of death, to give the impression that Cornelius died at 2:17, when in fact the medical evidence suggests he died between 1 and 2 o'clock, during a window when a specific person had a prepared alibi. She paused. The stopping of the clocks was painstaking work. It would have taken 10 minutes at minimum, likely closer to 15 in a shop of that size, loaded with mechanisms that required care not to damage. During those 15 minutes, the killer was alone with the dead man, and enough presence of mind to work methodically through every clock in the shop. That is not the behaviour of someone who panicked. That is the behaviour of someone who had, in some form, rehearsed this. Oliver Fenn cleared his throat. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything about you, Mr. Fenn," she said pleasantly. "Your interest in the Breguet watch gives you a financial motive, and your offer to Vivian immediately after Cornelius's death was at minimum in poor taste. But you did not kill him. You had no knowledge of the document that was the real motive, and you had no access to triazolum. She let this settle. Triazolum, she continued, is a prescription sedative, not widely available outside medical contexts. It is the kind of substance that requires either a prescription, which can be traced, or professional access to a pharmacological supply. She looked at the room. There is one person in this gathering who would have had unremarkable, professional, entirely unsuspicious access to it. Dr. Prentice was very still. He had been very still for some time. Not the stillness of someone frozen by surprise. The stillness of someone who has been waiting, who has been running the calculation for days, who knows the moment has arrived, and has made some interior decision about how to meet it. Maurice, he said, and his voice was even, quiet. The voice he used when he was talking to patients about difficult things. You should let me explain. There's nothing to explain, said Miss Marple. Not unkindly. I have the document. Something moved in his face, very briefly, a flicker of something raw and uncomposed. Then it was gone. He was going to destroy everything, he said. 30 years. Everything I built here. He could have come to me. We could have found a way. He did come to you, said Thomas from his footstool with the sudden directed clarity of someone who has been waiting to say this. He told you. That morning. You argued. Prentice looked at the boy, and the look was complicated. Not cruel, not dismissive, but exhausted with the complexity of it. He'd made up his mind, he said. He wasn't going to. He wouldn't listen. He said it was wrong, that it had always been wrong, and that he'd been a coward for 30 years. A pause. He wasn't entirely wrong about that. The admission was unexpected, and the room felt it. Vivian's hands clasped in her lap tightened. So you went back, Inspector Moss said, his voice careful, controlled, professional. Later that morning, I went home. He said this looking at the floor. I sat in my surgery. I thought about it for several hours, and then yes, I went back. A long pause. I'd had the triazolum from a patient who hadn't collected a prescription. I'd been keeping it for... He stopped. I'm not sure why I'd been keeping it. Because part of him had been moving toward this moment, Miss Marple thought, without allowing the conscious mind to name it. The thing people did when they couldn't acknowledge what they were contemplating. He let me in, Prentice continued. He made tea. Because that's what Cornelius did. Whatever had happened between us, he would still make tea. He still observed the rituals. Something crossed his face that was briefly grief. I put the triazolum in his cup while he was getting the milk. And then you waited, said Miss Marple quietly. I talked to him. While we waited for it to work. He didn't know. He thought I'd come back to discuss it further. Another pause. He was kind. Even then, arguing about this, he was fundamentally kind. He said he was sorry, that he'd thought for years about how to make it right without hurting me, and he'd never found a way. His voice was completely steady, which was somehow worse than if it hadn't been. And then he started to become drowsy, and he thought he was simply tired, and he sat back in his chair, and he closed his eyes. The silence in the room was absolute. I used the clock hand because it seemed... I'm not sure why. It was there. It felt appropriate, in some way I can't explain properly. He was a clockmaker. He looked up. That sounds like madness. It wasn't madness, it was something else. It was guilt, said Miss Marple, with a simple, direct gentleness that was neither accusation nor absolution. You wanted it to mean something, because it had to mean something. You couldn't let it be merely practical. He looked at her for a long moment. Then you stopped the clocks, she said. All of them. Every one. An act of extraordinary self-control in extraordinary circumstances. You stopped them at 2:17, which was an hour after you had committed the act. Giving yourself an alibi that placed you at your surgery during the supposed time of death, she paused. You washed your teacup. You checked the back window, forced it slightly to suggest external entry, and then you left through the front door, which was the easiest exit, and you walked calmly home. She looked at him across the room with the direct, unclouded gaze of someone who has seen a great deal of human failing and has long since given up requiring that failing to be anything other than what it is. But you made a mistake, she said. Not a technical mistake, a human one. When Inspector Moss described the manner of death to the assembled neighbours, everyone reacted with shock. Everyone asked how and with what and how terrible. You alone asked nothing. You nodded and stayed quiet. And accepted information you already had, she paused. People who are surprised always ask questions. People who are not surprised do not. Inspector Moss had risen from his chair. Sergeant Fielding was at the door. "Maurice Prentice," said the inspector, and whatever he felt about Miss Marple's involvement, his voice was steady and professional. "I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Cornelius Hatch. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something you later rely on in court." Prentice stood. He straightened his blazer with the automatic precision of a man tidying himself before an important meeting. He looked once around the room, at Vivian, at Thomas, at Mrs. Price's dark, carefully composed eyes, and then at Miss Marple. "You're very thorough," he said. It was not quite a compliment and not quite a criticism. It was the observation of someone who has been beaten by a superior player and can still, in some professional part of himself, acknowledge the quality of the game. "I learned from careful people," she said simply, and that was the truth of it, in the end. Part 11. After. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of weeks that succeed a great event, a quality of the everyday reasserting itself with almost aggressive normality, as though the village needed to demonstrate to itself that it could still simply be a village. The roses finished blooming and the late summer settled in with its particular English heaviness, warm and slightly overripe, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and something floral that had no single source. The postman whistled his 3 bars. The general store received its Saturday delivery. The regulars at the Heron and Hound drank their usual quantities of bitter and discussed the cricket with the sustained, detailed passion that the English reserve for things that don't really matter, because it is safer and more pleasant than applying that passion to things that do. Dr. Prentice had been charged with murder, and the village had responded to this with the characteristic English combination of private horror and public restraint. People did not discuss it directly in the high street. That would have been excessive. But they discussed it extensively in their own kitchens and sitting rooms, and the consensus that gradually formed was a complicated one. He had been a good doctor. He had been a good doctor for 26 years, and this was real, and it counted for something. And yet, Dolly Bantry said to Miss Marple on a Tuesday afternoon, over a very good pot of Darjeeling, he killed someone. He killed Cornelius, who was, whatever his faults, fundamentally more decent than almost anybody. She shook her head. "I always thought doctors were supposed to have a different relationship to death. More respect for it, somehow." "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that doctors have a very intimate relationship with death, which is not quite the same as respecting it. Sometimes intimacy breeds a different kind of familiarity than one might hope. Is that meant to explain it? Not at all. I don't think it can be explained in the deep sense. It can be understood, perhaps, which is different." She looked at her tea. "He was a man who made one bad choice 30 years ago. Not a dramatic choice, but just a quiet, convenient one, and who spent the following 30 years building a life on that choice, which meant building a life on the ongoing suppression of it. When the suppression became impossible, he made another choice. Each choice was, in its way, smaller and more terrible than the last. That's the nature of certain kinds of corruption." "Cheerful," said Dolly. "I don't think it's meant to be cheerful," said Miss Marple. "I think it's meant to be a caution." A pause. The first choice was the important one. If he had spoken up in 1991, even just gone to a solicitor and said, "Look here, I don't think this transfer is right," none of the rest would have happened. The lie required maintenance. The maintenance required sacrifice. The sacrifice finally required a life. She set down her cup. Dishonesty is very expensive in the long run. The Morrowland was dealt with through a legal process that took several months and involved, at various stages, a Canadian great-niece, 3 separate solicitors, a local heritage trust, and the very interested attention of the county council. In the end, and after considerable negotiation, the 20 acres were transferred to a community land trust, of the type that Arthur Morrow had vaguely but genuinely intended, available for small-scale local farming, with a public footpath along the stream and the ancient woodland protected in perpetuity. The great-niece, her name was Susan Morrow. She was a retired schoolteacher. Yeah, she'd been completely unaware of any of this until Cornelius's letter reached her, attended the signing ceremony, and stood in the middle of the field she had never seen before with an expression of peaceful bewilderment. "He wrote me such a kind letter," she said to Miss Marple, who had been invited to the ceremony and was standing nearby. "The clockmaker. He said he was sorry it had taken so long, that he should have spoken years before." "He spoke when he could," said Miss Marple. "That's not nothing." Oliver Fenn had, after a brief and respectful interval, renewed his offer for the Breguet watch to Vivian Hatch. She had sold it in the end, but not to Fenn. She had engaged a London auction house, which achieved £137,000 for it, and charged a commission that made Miss Marple's practical soul wince slightly. Vivian had used the proceeds to settle the most pressing of her debts, and had, according to Dolly's intelligence network, taken a rather serious look at her finances for possibly the first time in her adult life. "She telephoned me," Dolly reported, "to say thank you, which I thought was kind. She said she's going to try to be better with money, and she said—" Dolly paused with the air of someone producing the significant item last. "She's going to learn about clocks." "Is she?" "She said she felt she owed it to him, to understand what he spent his life on." Dolly shook her head. "I thought that was rather touching." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "so did I." Thomas Weir had been left, or, per Cornelius's will, a sum of £4,000 and the workbench from the shop, along with all its tools. He had also been left a letter, which Thomas did not share with anyone, but which left him, as Dolly observed, simultaneously bereft and oddly straightened, as though someone had believed in him so clearly and so specifically that the belief had become structural. He found a position with a watchmaker in Bristol, a proper clockmaker, old school, who took him on as an apprentice on the strength of a letter of recommendation that Cornelius had written 6 months before his death, as though he had known, or at least felt, that the time was limited and that certain things needed to be done in advance. Miss Marple thought about this sometimes. About the quiet efficiency of a man who had felt the approach of danger and had made his arrangements without panicking, had prepared the document, had prepared Thomas, had prepared the envelope, had done what he could to ensure that the truth would have a vehicle even if he himself did not survive to carry it. It was a kind of courage, she thought. Not a flashy kind. Not the kind that gets monuments, but the kind that is, finally, the most durable. On the morning of her last day in Little Fenwick, she walked the length of the High Street for the last time. Slowly, in the early light before the village properly woke. Past the post office, past the Heron and Hound with its hanging baskets, past the general store and down to the end of the lane where the old stone bridge crossed the stream. The clockmaker's shop was dark, as its sign still read, C. Hatch, Clockmaker, EST, 1978. The police tape was gone, the windows had been cleaned. Inside, through the glass, she could see the shapes of the clocks on their shelves still not running. Some would be claimed by Vivian, some would be sold. Some might find their way to collectors or to other shops. But for now they were silent, and the shop was empty, and the lane was perfectly quiet in the early morning, and she stood for a moment in the particular piece of a thing finished and thought, with a satisfaction that had no vanity in it, about the small, stubborn, necessary victory of the true over the convenient. She turned and walked back toward Dolly's cottage and breakfast and the morning train. Part 12. The Train to Saint. Mary Mead. The train left Little Fenwick station, which was not really a station at all, but a single platform and a waiting room the size of a garden shed, at 11:47 in the morning, and Miss Marple settled into her corner seat with the combination of relief and mild melancholy that always attended departures from places she had been glad to visit and was now glad to leave. Dolly had come to see her off, naturally. She would not have expected anything less. Dolly had hugged her with the robust, unsentimental warmth that was her characteristic mode of affection, handed her a small package of sandwiches for the journey. "You'll be famished by Swindon, Jane. I know you. You forget to eat when you're thinking," and stood on the platform with her usual vigour until the train was out of sight. It was the kind of departure that made you feel well looked after without making you feel managed, which was the highest distinction Miss Marple could think of to apply to a friendship, and she applied it without reservation. The countryside moved past the window in its patient, unconcerned way. Fields and hedgerows and the occasional farmhouse, then a small town, then more fields. England in August had a particular colour, she had always thought. Not quite green anymore, something more golden and tired, as though the summer had spent itself and was now reflecting on the effort. She opened the sandwich package. Dolly had made cheese and pickle, which was exactly right. She ate and thought, and the thinking was not the urgent, focused kind she had been doing for the past fortnight, but the gentler, retrospective kind. The kind you do when a thing is finished and you can look at it whole. What struck her most, looking back at the whole business of little Fenwick and the stopped clocks and the dead clockmaker, was not the cleverness, or the method, or even the particular human tragedy of a man who had made one quiet, dishonest choice 30 years ago and then spent a lifetime in its shadow. What struck her was the clocks themselves. Cornelius Hatch had spent his working life keeping time accurate, making the stopped things run, attending to the small mechanical truths of escapements and mainsprings and balance wheels with the kind of focused devotion that most people reserve for things they love. His shop had been a place where time was literally tended to, where someone cared that the second hand moved at the right speed, that the quarter-hour chime rang at the precise moment it should, that nothing pretended to be something it wasn't. And the act of stopping all his clocks, stopping them all at a false moment, stopping them all to tell a lie, had been, in its way, the most fitting possible desecration of everything he had stood for. It had been done by someone who had known him well enough to understand what it would mean, and who had done it anyway. That was the thing that had unsettled her most deeply about the case, and which she was only now on the train fully articulating to herself. You could kill a man with a clock hand, and there was a kind of brutal simplicity in it, a death by the tools of life, a violence with a metaphorical weight whether intended or not. But to stop all his clocks afterward, to use his own instruments of truth to tell a lie, that was a cruelty of a different order. It assumed that the things Cornelius had cared about could be turned against him, could be made to serve an untruth, could be made to pretend. She looked out the window at a passing field of stubble. The thing she'd noticed about the case, the thing she had told no one because it was not evidence of anything and proved nothing in a legal sense, was this. Whoever stopped those clocks had known how to stop them without damaging them. They had been stopped at 2:17, but they had been stopped correctly. The hands moved carefully, the mechanisms respected, the springs not overwound. Someone had spent 15 minutes in that room, in a state of agitation that no normal human being could have entirely suppressed, and had handled every one of those clocks with professional care. This told her something about Dr. Morris Prentice that she had turned over in her mind many times since, and had not resolved. She did not know whether to find it pitiful or simply sad. He had been a careful man, a professional man, a man who, even in the act of destroying his oldest friend's life's work, could not quite bring himself to be careless with the instruments. The murderer and the meticulous craftsman in the same body, in the same 15 minutes working side by side. It was, she supposed, the most human thing about the whole business, the inability to entirely abandon who you were, even when doing your worst. She folded the empty sandwich paper neatly into the pocket of her bag and took out her knitting. The wool was a soft blue-grey. She was making a cardigan for Raymond's wife, who had once admired the colour and who would be pleasantly surprised to receive something she had forgotten expressing admiration for. Miss Marple never forgot such things. It was one of the small, quiet pleasures of her nature. The needles clicked. The countryside continued its patient passing. She thought about St. Mary Mead, which was a village very like Little Fenwick in its outward aspect, small, settled, arranged around a green, possessed of the usual English village armature of church and pub and post office, and very different from it in the particular texture of her knowledge. In St. Mary Mead, she knew everything. She knew which marriages were troubled and which would last. She knew which young men were heading for difficulty and which would surprise everyone by becoming quietly exemplary. She knew the histories behind all the houses and the faces behind all the social performances. This knowledge was sometimes burden and sometimes gift. It meant that nothing that happened in St. Mary Mead surprised her very much, which was comfortable. It also meant that she saw clearly the human failings of everyone around her, which required a constant low-level exercise of charity. She had been to many places over the years, been useful in many places, and had always come home to St. Mary Mead with the knowledge that home was in some sense the only real school. That all the understanding she had developed about human nature had grown in that small, contained, knowable place, sold or... because it was there that she had first learned to look, to really look, and to understand that the difference between seeing and looking was the difference between receiving information and caring about what it means. Cornelius Hatch had been a man who looked. He had looked at the springs and wheels and balances of his clocks with the attention that comes from caring about their truth. And he had looked, finally, too late perhaps, but not too late, at the truth of what had happened 30 years before, and decided that looking away was no longer something he was willing to do. She thought he would have been glad to know that the truth had survived him, that it was in the hands of people who intended to do something with it, that the land was now where it should be, that Thomas was learning his trade, that Vivian was, possibly, beginning to manage herself with a little more of her uncle's discipline. He'd say it wasn't enough, she murmured to herself, very softly with a small smile. He'd say it should have been 30 years sooner. He'd say it was a poor substitute for doing it right the first time. She paused, needles still. But it's what there was, she said, and it's better than nothing, and sometimes better than nothing is the best available. The train came into her station at 2:18 in the afternoon, 1 minute late, which was close enough. She stepped out onto the platform and breathed the familiar air of St. Mary Mead, the particular combination of hedge and earth and recent rain that was unique to this one small corner of England, and felt the mild, contented click of return. The village was exactly as she'd left it. The roses were past their peak but still going. The elm had dropped a branch in the last storm. She would have to look into that, it was getting old. Mrs. Hartley next door had, predictably, allowed her front garden to reach a state that, while technically legal, represented a kind of passive comment on standards. She walked home slowly with her bag, in the afternoon light. In the sitting room she made tea, properly with attention, the way Cornelius Hatch would have approved of, and sat in her chair by the window with the knitting and the tea and the quiet. She thought, clocks keep time only when they are tended to. Truth keeps its shape only when someone is willing to tend to it, and the tending, the small, patient daily act of not looking away, is the difference between a thing that runs and a thing that merely pretends to. She picked up her needles again. Outside, the afternoon light moved across the garden in its unhurried way, and the village went about its business, and time kept its faithful, unsentimental count, indifferent to everything, to murders and to their solutions, to the living and the dead, to guilt and to grief and to all the complicated human noise between them, except the fact of its own passage, which was the one thing she had always felt that could be trusted absolutely. She knitted 3 more rows before the light faded. Then she put on the lamp and poured another cup and read until bedtime. All characters and situations in this story are fictional. Miss Marple is the creation of Agatha Christie. This fan fiction is written in tribute,